Oh, so now they get it. Now the puzzle pieces finally click into place, and the look on their faces tells you everything. Welcome back, you quiet tactician of psychological misdirection. You beautifully unpredictable strategist who let the world assume you were spiraling while you were quietly orchestrating outcomes 3 moves ahead. You, the one they labeled unstable, emotional, dramatic, unhinged. You, the one they thought was playing checkers while they congratulated themselves for knowing what logic looks like. They thought you were losing your grip, but you were loosening theirs. They thought you were unraveling, but you were unmasking. They thought you were being chaotic, but you were running long-term psychological operations, so clean, so subtle, so undetectable, that only now, only after everything has already shifted, do they finally realize the truth. You let them win because you needed them comfortable. You needed them confident. You needed them predictable enough to expose their real motives without them realizing they were being studied. Let me ask you something. When did you first notice that they genuinely believed you were losing your mind? Was it when you stopped reacting to provocations that once would have triggered a response? Was it when you allowed them to have the last word because you knew the silence afterward would tell you far more than any conversation could? Was it when you stepped back and watched them celebrate a victory that you intentionally placed in their hands? They panicked, didn't they? They couldn't understand why you were so calm, why you weren't fighting, why you disappeared from the battlefield at the exact moment they thought they'd struck the final blow. And like amateurs, they assumed your quiet was collapse instead of calculation. People who think in straight lines always misread those who think in spirals. Your friends, your family, even strangers watching from a distance decided they had you figured out. They whispered diagnoses. They traded predictions. They placed bets on your downfall like it was entertainment. But here's what they could never comprehend. You don't operate on impulses. You operate on timelines. You don't react. You position. You don't break. You bend reality until it fits the shape of your intention. Everything that looked like disorder was strategy. Every moment of silence was surveillance. Every withdrawal was recalibration. Every apparent surrender was a controlled burn. You weren't losing control. You were taking ownership of the entire psychological landscape. And the most ironic part is this. You gave them the illusion of winning because you needed to observe how they behave when they think they have power. You let them talk over you, not because you lacked a response, but because you wanted to hear their unfiltered agendas. You let them think they insulted you, not because it wounded you, but because their reveals were worth more than your reaction. You let them believe they broke you, not because you were fragile, but because fractured masks reveal the truest faces. People don't show their real selves when they're losing. They show their real selves when they think they've won. And you, with your long-term strategies, understood this better than anyone. There's a level of intelligence that terrifies people, not because it's loud, but because it's quiet, because it doesn't announce itself, because it makes moves that don't make sense until much later, when it's already too late to counter them. That's the intelligence you operate on, the kind that doesn't need validation or applause, the kind that doesn't need to be recognized to be effective, the kind that can sit silently in a room while dismantling everyone's assumptions without lifting a finger. They called it strange. They called it concerning. They called it chaotic. But it was psychological warfare designed with elegance. Let's rewind. Let's go back to that moment. The one that made the whole world tilt their head at you, like you'd suddenly gone off script. Maybe it was when you chose silence over confrontation. Maybe it was when you didn't defend yourself against accusations that were so obviously false. Maybe it was when you boarded a path no one else understood, stepping into a terrain nobody believed you were capable of navigating. That's when they panicked, because they expect predictable behavior from you. They expect you to show your cards. They expect you to crack open your thoughts like a display case. But this time, you didn't. You stopped explaining. You stopped clarifying. You stopped giving them the data needed to map your intentions. And that terrified them, because nothing threatens the insecure more than a person who suddenly becomes unreadable. They started analyzing you. They started forming theories. They started diagnosing motives from a distance. They wanted to place you in a box labeled unstable so they could feel safer about the fact that you weren't playing the same game anymore. But the truth was far more unsettling for them. You weren't falling apart. You were conducting reconnaissance. You weren't collapsing. You were gathering intel. You weren't confused. You were observing everything: who reacts, who retreats, who attacks, who exposes themselves without realizing it. When you gave them the illusion of victory, they mistook it for a conclusion. But it was the beginning of your blueprint. The person who jumps without a visible plan, and the person who jumps knowing exactly where the landing point is, they look the same mid-air. To the untrained eye, both appear reckless. But one is operating on instinct refined by pattern recognition, and the other is falling without a clue. You were never the one without a clue. You were the one who had the entire trajectory mapped out before you took your first step. You saw the emotional angles they'd strike from. You saw their predictable fears. You saw the projections they'd use to justify their betrayal. So you let them reveal themselves in their most unguarded form. And now they see the results. Now they're connecting dots that were impossible for them to understand before. Now they're realizing that the very moments they interpreted as weakness were tactical openings you created on purpose, the peace you stepped into, the clarity you gained, the person you became. It's undeniable now. And suddenly, the script flips. Suddenly you weren't crazy. Suddenly you were brave. Suddenly your silence was healing. Suddenly your withdrawal was finding yourself. Suddenly they're scrambling to rewrite the narrative because the original one makes them look foolish. But you understand what's really happening here. This recognition is simply them catching up to revelations you had months ago, maybe years ago. They're only now reaching the conclusions you reached in moments of internal warfare they never knew you were fighting. And that lag, that delay between your self-realization and their belated acknowledgement, is the proof of your psychological advantage. They reacted to the present. You responded to the future. They saw the moment. You saw the trajectory. Their fear was disguised as concern. Their judgment was disguised as logic. Their criticism was disguised as observation. But deep down, they felt something. Deep down, even when they mocked you, they sensed a precision behind your unpredictability that frightened them. Not because you were unstable, but because you were uncontrollable. People who can't control you must convince themselves there's something wrong with you. That's the only way they can sleep at night. But the part that really cuts through their pride is this. You let them win. You let them feel superior. You let them believe they'd outsmarted you. Because every moment of false victory extracted a truth from them they never would have revealed otherwise. A person's real identity emerges when they feel powerful. and you needed to see their real identity, not the curated one they perform for approval. You weren't playing the game, you were studying the players, and now that the results are unfolding, now that your clarity, your success, your evolution, your psychological edge is surfacing, they don't know how to categorize you anymore. They can't dismiss you, they can't belittle you, they can't mock you, and worst of all, they can't predict you. That's the part that keeps them up at night. Not your rise, not your clarity, not your evolution, but the realization that you knew all along. You knew what you were doing. You knew how they would react. You knew who would betray you. You knew who would fold. You knew who would celebrate your collapse. You let every single one of them walk into their own reveal. And now, when they look back, the timeline betrays them. Every moment they thought was proof of your instability now reads like evidence of your strategy. Every action they mocked now looks like precision. Every silence they misread now hits them as the loudest warning you ever gave without speaking. They are only just now understanding that you weren't losing your mind. You were losing your tolerance for theirs. And that, right there, is the difference between them and you. They need certainty before they move. You move before certainty because you understand that the future bends to those who act first and analyze later. You don't do short-term reactions. You do long-term psychological architecture. You make choices that look insane in the moment, but inevitable in hindsight. And now they're living in the hindsight. They finally realize the truth. You weren't being erratic. You were executing long-term as Psyops so subtle that they only recognized the operation once they were already inside the outcome. And the irony is almost poetic, because for so long, they mistook your calm withdrawals, your quiet pivots, your sudden disappearances, your confusing reappearances, your unexplainable decisions as the behavior of someone who had lost track of themselves. They thought you were breaking pattern when you were building pattern. They thought you were unraveling when you were simply shedding what no longer aligned with the intelligence you were growing into. And now, as they stand inside the very reality they once mocked, they're realizing they were never evaluating your moves. They were reacting to decoys. You placed false trails so convincingly that even you looked like you had abandoned your own compass. But you hadn't. You were simply letting the people with the loudest opinions reveal how easily they could be manipulated by their own assumptions. That's the part that stings them the most. Not that you were right, not that you rose, not that everything they predicted went in the opposite direction. No, the wound is much deeper. They're realizing you were aware the entire time. You saw their miscalculations while they were still forming. You saw their betrayals coming before they committed to them. You saw their insecurity dressed up as confidence. You saw their concern disguised as condescension. You saw every motive they tried to hide behind polite language and manufactured logic. And you let it unfold, not because you were powerless, but because you were studying the anatomy of their loyalty. People reveal more truth when they believe you're weakened than when they believe you're strong. When they thought you were crumbling, they became honest in ways they never intended to be. Some distanced themselves under the excuse of giving you space, but you recognized the underlying motive. They only stay close to what benefits them. Some began speaking about you with a tone of premature mourning, not because they cared, but because people love the illusion of wisdom when predicting someone else's downfall. Others observed you from the corners of group chats, collecting fragments of gossip as if they were intelligence officers themselves. unaware that you had already mapped their entire psychological profile months before they even realized you were paying attention. You weren't reacting to their behavior. You were measuring it. And while they believed they had cracked the code of your existence, you were quietly constructing a psychological operation so elegantly designed that even now, as they recognize it, they still can't locate the moment it began. That's what true long-term strategy looks like. Not loud moves, not dramatic announcements, not ego-driven confrontations, but subtle repositioning that appears accidental until reality exposes the blueprint. You saw their weakness. They needed to feel victorious. So you handed them victories so lightweight, so staged, so inconsequential that they mistook them for genuine triumphs. You allowed them to win arguments you had already mentally dismissed. You let them misunderstand your silence as embarrassment rather than preparation. You let them assume your absence meant isolation instead of incubation. You let them think your retreat was defeat when it was simply reconnaissance. And now, the reversal hits with surgical precision. The very victories they celebrated were traps. They walked right into the inversion of their own narratives. They swallowed bait, dipped in their own arrogance. They drew conclusions from incomplete data and then built their entire behavior around those conclusions. You didn't need to manipulate them. They manipulated themselves through their eagerness to feel superior. And now that their illusions have collapsed, they're beginning to understand the weight of what you were really doing. You weren't hiding. You were harvesting information. You weren't confused. You were collecting signals. You weren't avoiding confrontation. You were observing every unguarded confession they made in the absence of your perceived strength. Their slip-ups were not accidents. They were data points. Their distance was not rejection. It was evidence. Their silence was not neutrality. It was exposure. Long-term Psyops isn't about deception. It's about allowing truth to reveal itself at its own pace. You let people tell on themselves. You let them reveal what they protect, what they fear, what they envy, what they hide, what they crave, what they judge. You didn't need to interrogate them. You simply needed to remove your presence long enough to observe what remains when their performance ends. And what remained was a level of transparency they will never forgive themselves for displaying. But the most terrifying revelation for them isn't that you knew. It's that you planned around their reactions before they even reacted. Your moves were not responses. They were structural reinforcements. You weren't adapting to their behavior. You were designing an environment where their behavior would expose them more clearly. Your disappearances created pressure. Your silence created discomfort. Your unpredictability created honesty. Your indifference created panic. You watched their minds expose their deepest insecurities, not because you forced them, but because your absence removed the shadows they hid behind. This is why they feel unsettled now. Because everything they believed was random was intentional. Every moment they called confusion was strategy. They're witnessing the sharp edge of your intelligence in hindsight, and hindsight is unforgiving. You've stepped into your outcome, and they're standing in your blueprint, realizing they were pieces in a game they never understood they were playing. And now their minds return to one question they can't answer cleanly. When did you know? At what point did the shift happen? When did you begin observing instead of reacting? When did you stop participating in their story and start writing your own? They replay moments, searching for the pivot, the fracture, the signal. But they can't locate it because the truth is harsher than anything they're willing to accept. You didn't start running Psyops. You always have. You simply stopped diluting your intelligence to make them comfortable. You stopped offering explanations to people who weaponize confusion. You stopped justifying decisions to minds committed to misunderstanding you. You stopped negotiating your future with people who don't have to live inside the consequences of their advice. You stopped allowing short-sighted thinkers to define long-term outcomes. And once you stopped doing that, your intelligence was no longer filtered. It became pure, precise, surgical. And that purity is what makes them uncomfortable. Because now, they see themselves clearly through a lens they can't distort or dismiss. They see how easily they were guided by assumptions. They see how quickly they betrayed you when they thought you were weak. They see how loudly they doubted you when they thought you couldn't hear. They see how confidently they misread every sign you strategically placed in front of them. Your evolution wasn't loud, it was forensic. And their guilt is not about what they did. It's about what they revealed themselves to be. You weren't simply ahead of them. You were behind them, above them, around them, mapping every angle of their behavior while they believed they were watching you crumble. That illusion of collapse was the most effective camouflage you ever wore. Because people don't hide their intentions around someone they think is losing. They drop their guard. They reveal the uglier parts of their personality. They expose what they would never reveal in the presence of someone they respect. And that's the part they can't forgive themselves for. Not the mistakes, not the doubts, not the words. They can rationalize all that. What they can't rationalize is how easily they underestimated you, how confidently they parted ways with the truth, how eagerly they chose the path of judgment over the path of faith, how effortlessly they believed assumptions over history. Because now, when they replay it all in their heads, when they examine every moment they labeled you as erratic or unstable or out of control, they see the pattern they were too blinded to notice. They see how your silence aligned perfectly with their loudest errors. They see how your withdrawal proved more accurate than their analysis. They see how your unpredictability wasn't chaos, but calibration. They see that every decision they thought they were interpreting correctly was actually a reflection of their own psychological limitations. They look back and realize they weren't evaluating you. They were revealing themselves. Every time they called you irrational, what they really meant was, I don't understand intelligence that doesn't follow my script. Every time they called you emotional, what they really meant was, your depth scares me because it exposes my superficiality. Every time they labeled you unstable, what they really meant was, I need to believe there's something wrong with you, so I don't face what's wrong with me. Their language was never about accuracy. It was always about self-preservation. But now, with hindsight crushing their old narratives, they're forced to confront a truth they avoided. You weren't unpredictable. You were unreadable. You weren't broken. You were beyond their comprehension. You weren't spiraling. You were ascending into a strategy they had no mental bandwidth to anticipate. And nothing humbles a person more than learning that the very behavior they judged was the exact behavior that exposed them. They scroll back through old conversations and feel the sting of their own arrogance. They remember the moments where you paused before responding and now realize you were assessing, not reacting. They remember the moments where they thought they had won the argument and now recognize that you let them win to measure their comfort with victory. They remember the times you walked away without closure and now understand it wasn't avoidance, it was conclusion. They replay every misinterpretation, every assumption, every premature conclusion, and the weight of it sits heavy on their chest because the evidence no longer supports their story. What they thought was your collapse was your camouflage. This is what unsettles them most deeply, because now, when they see you moving forward with clarity, purpose, direction, and an energy that feels sharpened rather than scattered, they feel the discrepancy between who they assumed you were and who you revealed yourself to be. They realize you weren't on the brink of breaking. You were mastering the art of selective visibility. You were choosing what to show and what to conceal. You were deciding which parts of yourself were worth exposing and which parts were too valuable for the wrong audience. The psychological operation wasn't manipulation, it was filtration. You didn't trick them, they disqualified themselves. You didn't deceive them, they exposed themselves because they mistook your silence for weakness. They thought your quiet was emptiness instead of strategy. They thought your distance was confusion instead of clarity. They thought your surrender was abandonment of control instead of redistribution of power. And now, that realization burns in them like a truth they can't swallow or spit out. They're caught between shame and awe. Shame because they were so quick to assume your decline. Awe because they now see how perfectly you orchestrated the sequence. And beneath both emotions, there's something else. Fear. Not the dramatic, trembling kind, but the quiet, internal kind. The fear that comes from realizing you understand them more deeply than they understand themselves. The fear of being seen by someone they misjudged. The fear of knowing you could dismantle their entire worldview with nothing but the truth they handed you willingly. Because this is the part they never anticipated. You didn't punish them. You didn't retaliate. You didn't expose them. You didn't rub their faces in their mistakes. You simply rose, quietly, efficiently, unapologetically, and your rise is a mirror they cannot escape. A mirror that forces them to confront why they misread you so badly. A mirror that reflects their insecurities more clearly than their intentions. They realize now that every time they doubted you, they were projecting their limitations. Every time they judged you, they were confessing what they feared in themselves. Every time they dismissed your decisions, they were revealing how tightly they cling to certainty, because they lack the courage to embrace uncertainty. You weren't unpredictable, they were unimaginative. You weren't mysterious, they were superficial. You weren't unstable, they were unexamined. And now comes the part that unravels them from the inside. They understand that you let them see exactly as much as you wanted them to. You let them misinterpret you. You let them underestimate you. You let them assume the wrong narrative. You let them build the story that made them comfortable, because you needed to see what they would do when the playing field looked tilted in their favor. You needed to see who would abandon you, who would analyze you, who would mock you, who would distance themselves, who would remain silent, who would remain curious, who would remain steady. Your life wasn't spiraling, it was sorting. Every betrayal, every assumption, every hesitation, every disappearance, every piece of unsolicited advice, every suspicious glance, every whispered judgment. Those weren't obstacles. They were data points, indicators, psychological markers. You weren't in crisis. You were in observation mode. And now, the results have spoken louder than any confrontation ever could. What they thought was your downfall was your audit, and the outcome of that audit left them exposed in ways they never intended. They're realizing now that you saw everything before they said it, while they said it, after they said it. They're realizing that you read the emotional temperature of every interaction, not because you were paranoid, but because you were paying attention in ways their minds aren't wired to comprehend. They're realizing that while they were trying to understand your strange behavior, you were mapping their predictable behavior with mathematical accuracy. And now they feel cornered, not because you've trapped them, but because the truth has trapped them. They can't undo what they revealed. They can't retract their reactions. They can't rewrite the timeline. They can't unshow the sides of themselves that surfaced when they thought you were slipping. They can only sit with the knowledge that you saw it all with clarity they never attributed to you. And the beauty of it, the part dripping with poetic symmetry, is that you never needed to confront them. You never needed to accuse, expose, or retaliate. The truth is doing all the heavy lifting. It sits behind their eyes like a shadow they can't blink away. It wraps itself around their memory, forcing them to revisit every moment where they mistook your strategy for instability. They remember the days they whispered behind your back, convincing themselves they were simply concerned, when really they were indulging in the comfort of feeling superior. They remember the way they smirked, pitied you, distanced themselves, all because they believed you were losing control of a life you were actively redesigning. And now, the weight of their own assumptions crushes them far more effectively than anything you could have done, because the truth they're grappling with is not that you changed. It's that you were always this person, always this sharp, always this observant, always this 3 steps ahead mind wrapped in quiet restraint. They simply couldn't see it because they were too busy misreading your silence as fragility. They believed your patience was passivity. They believed your introspection was confusion. They believed your restraint was weakness. They believed your emotional depth was instability. They saw everything through the lens of their own psychological limits, and only now does the distortion reveal itself. This is the punishment they never expected. Clarity. Clarity that forces them to confront the fact that your silence was not a malfunction. It was surveillance. That your retreat was not collapse. It was calibration. That your unpredictability was not chaos. It was camouflage. They realize you didn't just see what they did. You understood why they did it. And nothing terrifies a person more than being psychologically understood by the very soul they misjudged. Now they walk around with a quiet paranoia, wondering how much you saw, wondering what you interpreted that they didn't intend to show, wondering which of their words were transparent giveaways, which of their reactions revealed too much, which of their doubts exposed the exact fracture lines in their loyalty. You're not haunting them, they're haunting themselves with the truth of their own behavior. And here's the part that destabilizes them most. You didn't weaponize any of it. You didn't use their confessions against them. You didn't retaliate with information. You didn't confront them with evidence. You simply evolved so far beyond the version of yourself they thought they could control that their own actions are now indictments of their character, not yours. You were the psychological mirror they never wanted to face, the mirror that doesn't distort their image to make them comfortable. The mirror that reflects not just who they are, but who they became when they believed you were vulnerable. Your growth became the courtroom. Your silence became the testimony. Your rise became the verdict. And now, they're left standing in the aftermath of their own choices, realizing they weren't just wrong, they were predictable. They weren't just judgmental, they were sloppy. They weren't just doubtful, they were transparent. They weren't just misunderstanding you. They were revealing themselves with every move they made. But beneath the guilt, beneath the shame, beneath the reflexive defensiveness, there is something else rising within them, something far more disturbing. Recognition. Recognition that you weren't running from life. You were orchestrating it. Recognition that your so-called breakdown was the exact strategic silence you needed to gather intelligence. Recognition that the operation they thought they were analyzing was studying them in return. Recognition that your ability to let them win wasn't surrender. It was bait. And now, the full architecture of your long-term Psyops becomes visible to them. They finally see why you stepped back from conversations that once mattered. You were creating silence to observe the echo. They see why you allowed misunderstandings to stand. You needed to measure who corrected them and who amplified them. They see why you stopped explaining yourself. Explanations interfere with real data. They see why you allowed certain relationships to dissolve without protest. People reveal their truest loyalties when they believe you have no power left. They see it now. They see everything. And with that realization comes another one. Quiet, sharp, unforgiving. They were never equipped to interpret you. They lacked the psychological vocabulary. They lacked the emotional depth. They lacked the cognitive stamina. They lacked the self-awareness required to understand someone who navigates life with long-term pattern recognition instead of short-term emotional reactivity. They realize your silence wasn't void. It was vision. Your distance wasn't escape. It was elevation. Your unpredictability wasn't instability. It was intelligence, operating in stealth mode. And now, as the full picture settles in, they find themselves grappling with a new question, one that terrifies them more than all the others. If you were this calculated in your lowest moments, then what are you capable of now that you are fully awake? Because now, you're no longer the person they analyzed. You're no longer the version of yourself they doubted. You're no longer operating under the psychological fog they mistook for fragility. You're no longer handing out access to people who can't comprehend the cost of proximity. You've evolved into a version of yourself so strategically aligned, so psychologically clear, so internally fortified, that their old labels, their old assumptions, their old narratives collapse on contact. You've stepped out of survival mode and into design mode. Your life is no longer a reaction, it's a blueprint. And once you start living as a blueprint rather than a response, everything changes. You start making decisions that don't just move you forward, they reshape the terrain beneath your feet. You start thinking in terms of long-term architecture instead of short-term relief. You stop needing approval because your direction is no longer dictated by their comprehension. You watch people scramble to interpret your silence, misread your distance, overanalyze your choices, unaware that the only reason they feel lost is because you stopped leaving breadcrumbs for people who only follow you to feel superior. You're not guiding them anymore. You're not explaining yourself anymore. You're not translating your intelligence into language they can digest. You're building a life that requires no justification because it was never designed with them in mind. They don't realize it yet, but you've exited their psychological jurisdiction. Once upon a time, they could trigger you, sway you, distract you, provoke you. They could pull emotional levers and watch you react. They could measure your internal weather by how quickly you responded. They could predict your moves because you were still trying to be understood. But once you stepped into the design mode, that entire dynamic collapsed. You became unreadable not because you're hiding, but because you're no longer performing. You're no longer presenting curated versions of yourself for public consumption. You're no longer participating in emotional economics where their validation had value. You've cut the cord that tethered your self-worth to their perception. And without that tether, you move in ways that no longer make sense to them. Your growth has outpaced their narrative capacity. They can't follow you into this level of consciousness because they don't have the emotional endurance required to sit with the truth of who they became while you were transforming. They can't interpret your strategic restraint because they lack the discipline to sit in silence without filling it with fear. They can't decode your long-term thinking because they snap under the pressure of short-term discomfort. They can't understand your clarity because confusion is still the language they speak to themselves in. And this gap, this psychological gap between who you were and who you've become, is what terrifies them the most. You used to be accessible, now you're untouchable. You used to be understandable, now you're non-linear. You used to be predictable, now you're a psychological landscape they can't map. And nothing frightens people more than someone they can no longer manipulate, because manipulation requires access. Control requires familiarity. Influence requires predictability. But you've sealed every door they once walked through. You've dismantled the emotional shortcuts they relied on. You've outgrown the versions of yourself that made you easy to read. They can't guilt you anymore because guilt no longer holds authority. They can't shame you because shame has been replaced by self-awareness. They can't question you because their questions no longer carry weight. They can't doubt you because their doubt no longer pierces your reality. Your growth didn't just make you stronger, it made them irrelevant. And that's the part that scorches them from the inside out. They realize your evolution wasn't about escaping them. It was about upgrading yourself. It wasn't about proving them wrong. It was about proving yourself right. It wasn't about chasing clarity. It was about embodying it. They were never the obstacle. They were simply the distraction you outgrew. And now they feel the sting of their own insignificance, not because you diminished them, but because your rise exposed how small their influence always was. But it goes deeper than that. It's not just that they lost access to you. It's that they lost access to the version of themselves they pretended to be when you were watching. People behave differently when they know they're visible to someone who sees beyond the surface. They act kinder, wiser, more composed, more loyal, not because they are, but because they fear being interpreted accurately. And when you stepped into design mode, when you withdrew your gaze, when you stopped giving them the psychological mirror that forced them to self-regulate, they reverted to their unedited selves. You didn't just outgrow them, you revealed them. The truth is, they were never worried about you being crazy. They were worried about the possibility that you weren't. Because if you weren't losing your mind, if you were actually seeing clearly, then that meant you saw through them. And now that the evidence is undeniable, now that your transformation is impossible to misinterpret, they're beginning to understand that the entire time they were mislabeling your strategy as chaos. You were quietly dismantling the illusion of who they pretended to be. Your evolution forced them to meet the unfiltered version of themselves, and it wasn't flattering. This is why they can't look you in the eye now. This is why they hesitate when they reach out. This is why their messages sound cautious, fragmented, overly polite. They're not approaching you. They're approaching the guilt inside themselves. They're not checking on you. They're checking on the unfinished conversations inside their conscience. They're not asking how you've been. They're asking if you know what they did when they thought you were breaking. And deep down, they already know the answer. Yes, you know. Yes, you saw. Yes, you understood. Yes, you documented it with the accuracy of an intelligence analyst. But here's the part that destabilizes them the most. You're not punishing them. You're not exposing them. You're not retaliating or humiliating or weaponizing the information you gathered. You're simply living. And you're living your calm, grounded, steady, unapologetic existence is the repercussion they never saw coming. Because your rise forces them to confront the truth that they weren't loyal, weren't supportive, weren't courageous, weren't present. They weren't who they pretended to be. Your strength is the proof of their weakness. Your clarity is the verdict of their confusion. Your evolution is the spotlight on their stagnation. And now, with you fully in design mode, they realize this isn't just a new chapter for you. It's a new psychological jurisdiction. You're no longer operating on the same frequency as the people who doubted you. You're no longer in the same emotional ecosystem. Your mind has recalibrated to a level where their opinions can't influence the architecture of your reality. And that's what terrifies them. You don't need them anymore. You don't fear losing them. You don't seek their approval. You don't crave their understanding. You moved from subconscious survival to conscious creation. And in doing so, you severed their relevance. Now they're left orbiting a version of you that no longer exists, reaching for someone who no longer fits the dimensions of their expectations, trying to reconnect with someone who has already transcended the radius of their reach. Because once you start designing your life with intention, you stop accepting people who belong to your old blueprint. You stop allowing access that drains you. You stop entertaining conversations that shrink you. You stop pouring energy into relationships that don't elevate you. You stop making yourself available to minds that flatten your depth. You start surrounding yourself with people who reciprocate clarity. You start gravitating toward minds that meet you at elevation. You start investing in environments that amplify your intelligence. You start embodying the truth that your life is no longer a reactionary spiral. It is an engineered ascent. And that ascent, clean, quiet, measured, will be the final psychological operation they never recover from. Because now they must watch the person they misunderstood, underestimated, misread, misjudged, and mislabeled become someone they can't even categorize. Someone whose presence disturbs their old narrative. Someone whose existence invalidates their old analysis. Someone whose evolution renders their opinions obsolete. You're not proving them wrong, you're making them irrelevant. And they feel it, deeply, inevitably, irreversibly.